I am sitting in a room full of fucking idiots. You dumb motherfuckers! You know what you did? You take Johnny O'Rourke's kid and you put him on as general organizer, pay him 36 fucking grand. At the same time, you let him sell insurance to his fucking father's... To his fucking father's locals! Damn it! How do you do that? How stupid can you be? That fucking cocksucker Kennedy has got his nose up my ass everywhere I go. You don't know that they're hounding me. They're looking at everything I do, and you let this happen in public? You're giving it to him. I'm going to jail. You understand? I'm going to prison. Because of you. You dumb motherfuckers. This is what you wanted. You wanted to put me in jail. Tell me now, so I can kill you. Right here.
Organized crime was built on two things: honor and betrayal. You didn't survive without both. Luciano understood that from the start. He surrounded himself with men who studied the game like it was a science. Some read the history of emperors and conquerors, learning how to control men and carve up empires. One of them was Meyer Lansky. He was no street brawler. He was a historian in a tailored suit. He wanted to know what made Sicilians tick before he worked with them. He taught Luciano the patience of the chess player. Luciano taught Lansky the other side of the coin, how to stick the knife in when the time came. First, Joe Masseria was out, then Salvatore Maranzano. Before them, Tom Rayner and others had been erased. When Prohibition ended, the big names started to fall. Al Capone in Chicago, and in New York, Thomas Dewey put Dutch Schultz in his sights. The heat on Schultz got so bad the bosses held a sit-down. If Dutch went to prison, they'd slice up his business. If he walked free, he'd get it back. But Schultz came out of prison knowing Dewey wasn't letting go, and he planned to take Dewey out. That's when another betrayal surfaced. Luciano and his circle already had their own grievances with Schultz. Before Dutch could make his move, Dewey had him back in court. Dutch's obsession shifted. He wanted Dewey dead more than he wanted to go after the Italians. The bosses met again. Decision: Dutch Schultz had to go. Luciano agreed. Schultz was hit. 3 years later, 1936, Dewey turned his guns on Luciano. The trial was public, humiliating. Behind bars, Luciano saw more betrayals play out. Louis Lepke Buchalter, the head of murder in Cannes, was handed over to Hoover himself. Luciano had done the same trick before. In 1923, arrested on narcotics charges, he'd got clear by feeding information. Dewey called him a stool pigeon. The label stuck. Luciano and Lansky bragged about taking down rivals without firing a shot. IRS cases, Hoover's agents, quiet tips to the right people. Waxy Gordon was one of those tips. Word of these betrayals didn't stay buried. One man who heard it was Carlo Gambino. By 1959, Vito Genovese, Carmine Galante, and Vincent Gigante were all headed to prison. Gambino was in New York, keeping his own circle tight. Most of his men had no idea what had gone down, and by the time they figured it out, it was too late. Gambino was at the top now, boss of a syndicate tied into others across the country. He had been at Appalachin, and over the next decade he'd build ties with Russell Bufalino, Santo Trafficante, Carlos Marcello, and the Cleveland outfit. And he'd be tested in ways no boss before him had. The Immigration Department wanted him deported. The Federal Bureau of Narcotics wanted him on drug charges. The IRS wanted him for tax evasion. Other agencies circled. Gambino was like Lansky, only he didn't need to study Sicilian history. He lived it. He saw America for what it was, a land that preached virtue but practiced hypocrisy. Perfect for a man like him. The 1950s were fading. The 60s were moving in. Anastasia, gone. Adonis, gone. Scalise, dead. There were no bosses above him now. Just Carlo and his inner circle, family, in-laws, old Anastasia men who'd come up in Prohibition. His family wasn't the biggest, but it was sharp enough to take New York apart, one block at a time. Gambino liked quiet moves, no wasted motion. But the streets were changing. Even the air felt different. First, the cars. Back in Sicily, he'd watched handmade machines rip down dirt roads. In America, he wasn't flashy, but he loved Cadillacs. The new models of the 60s, smoothly powerful, felt like the new America. Gambino was on top of it. Then the music changed. The crooners were fading. Sinatra was yesterday. The radio pumped out rock and roll, black singers talking jazz and heroin, white singers bragging about cocaine. Gambino hated drugs, always had. To him, they were poison. Now they were being sold in 3-minute songs. Even the papers were shifting. Headlines hinted that America was reaching for an empire just as old empires were falling apart. In Cuba, Castro took power, promising freedom from foreign control. For America's enemies, it was inspiration. While Castro took Havana, Gambino kept his head down, dodging the McClellan Committee, avoiding deportation, keeping the law away from his rackets. By '58, he'd managed it. Then he looked south. Cuba was Castro's now. For Gambino, it meant two things: loss and opportunity. By the late '50s, the mafia's structure was shifting. Carlo Gambino could see it. If he wanted to keep his seat, he'd have to decide who sat where and who didn't. The committee hearings were still running in Washington, peeling back the mob's cover. But the country's attention was elsewhere. In the early 1950s, Senator Kefauver had punched a hole in the mafia, dragging names into the spotlight. But McCarthy's Red Scare saved them. Overnight, nobody cared about organized crime. The public was fixated on communists in the Pentagon and homosexuals in Langley. The Rosenbergs, the Army McCarthy hearings, those were the headlines. By '57, even the Appalachin disaster didn't stick. A year later, new hearings threatened to open them up again. But then Cuba blew up. Castro and Batista's war grabbed the front page. The McClellan Committee's mob exposés faded, but the blueprints they'd revealed were burned into the public record. Gambino read the map. The names were out there now. No speculation needed. And many of them were friends. Carlos Marcello in New Orleans had been tight with Gambino since the ration stamp scams and oil rackets of the '40s. Their network stretched from gas stations in Louisiana to docks in New York. Marcello's people worked hand in glove with United Fruit, which moved produce from Central America into the U.S. The Boston docks, United Fruit's turf, were sliding under the control of Raymond Patriarca in Rhode Island. Patriarca ran a money laundering machine disguised as legitimate business. Down in Florida, Santo Trafficante Jr. was more than an ally. He was practically family. Gambino had been asked by Santo Sr. himself to keep an eye on the kid back in the '30s and '40s. In Ohio, the Scalish family kept one foot in Cleveland and the other in Havana. They moved weapons, ran arms to Batista loyalists, and funneled money into Cuban casinos. They were tied to Gambino, Marcello, Trafficante, and Russell Bufalino. The Cleveland outfit's fingerprints were all over the anti-Castro gun-running boom. On May 22, 1959, it broke open. Customs agents in Miami seized an old Air Force C-74 loaded with $28,000 worth of illegal weapons, 200,000 rounds, 17 machine guns, 38 Garands, and carbine parts. Destination: the Dominican Republic, then to Castro's enemies in Cuba. The cast read like a mob roll call: Augusto Ferrando, Dominican consul in Miami. His vice consul, Newark businessman Leonard Trento. Miami cop Joseph Licori, once bodyguard to Trujillo's son, and Dominic Bartone, a Cleveland aircraft broker with mob ties. The operation linked Batista's old guard, Dominican officials, and American syndicates. The plane was owned by Acros Dynamic of Cleveland, fresh from buying 11 surplus Air Force transports. On the tarmac, pilots, Cuban nationals, and mob-connected fixers prepped for takeoff. The takedown happened in a remote maintenance area just before the engines turned over. 11 arrests, a standoff at the Dominican consulate, federal grand jury indictments. Some charges died for lack of evidence. Others stuck. Ferrando got probation for bribery and arms smuggling. Bartone and Licori were fined. For the mob, it was proof. Cuba wasn't just about casinos. It was about controlling the island's future, even if it meant moving US military hardware into a revolution. Cleveland's history in the game went back to the 30s. It sat at the crossroads of Stefano Magaddino's Buffalo family and John Scalish's Cleveland outfit. Bufalino in Pennsylvania moved their product, guns, ammo, into anti-Castro pipelines. Bartone's name kept turning up, arms to the Dominican Republic, plots to help Batista, later popping up in declassified files tied to the JFK assassination. He was a con man with Teamsters ties to Hoffa and Cleveland's Nunzio babe Triscaro. He ran guns south and imported Cuban sugar north. FBI sources put him in Cuba in '59 with a man named Jack LaRue, possibly Jack Ruby, trying to sell Castro planes and combat gear. The Castro double agent they pitched, William Alexander Morgan, was executed in '61. Bartone's web touched CIA-linked industrialists, Soviet defectors, and anti-Castro commandos. Officially, Cleveland's link to JFK's murder was marginal. Unofficially, it sat in the same orbit as Marcello, Trafficante, and the rest who had lost millions in Havana. Beyond Cleveland, the network was massive. John LaRocca in Pittsburgh worked United Fruit angles, his roots going back to Salvatore Banana King Catanzaro. LaRocca's people were tied to Bufalino, Chicago, Detroit, the Gambinos, the Genoveses, Kansas City, Rochester, and Trafficante. In New York, Gambino's closest ally was Tommy Lucchese. Across the river, Simone, Sam the plumber de Cavalcante when war between Gambino, Lucchese, and others ignited with Joe Bonanno. Sam de Cavalcante mediated between the Bonanos and the Commission. In Buffalo, aging Magaddino was giving way to Bufalino's rise. The Genovese family, its boss in prison, was being run by lieutenants like Lombardo, Mike Miranda, Jerry Katina, and Jimmy Blue Eyes Allo. The Profati family was collapsing, Joe Profati was dying, and Joe Magliocco lined up as successor. But when Magliocco tried to take out Gambino with Bonanno, he was removed. Joe Colombo took over and became one of Gambino's staunchest allies, partnering with Marcello in real estate. In Detroit, Joe Zerilli was untouchable. No prosecutor could touch him. His influence rivaled industrial giants. Even Marcello respected his reach. In Chicago, Sam Giancana was consolidating power. Flashy, dangerous, tying into Dallas and national racing wires. In Rockford, Joseph Zamuto ran a syndicate corporate hybrid. Anthony Giordano in St. Louis was in on the Vegas skim and Israeli connections, another Gambino ally from World War II ration stamp days. Nicholas Civella's Kansas City family was politically entrenched, tied to Chicago but independent. Frank Balistrieri in Milwaukee ran a white-collar machine with muscle to match. Civello in Texas was effectively part of Marcello's New Orleans empire, pulling in $700 million a year from the state in the 50s and 60s. Even the Murchison oil dynasty played ball. These were the men rising in the 60s, and Carlo Gambino was sitting in the middle of them. Not the loudest, not the flashiest, but the one building a web that would outlast them all. Carlo Gambino wasn't standing alone. He had a crew, not young guns, but the old shooters from Albert Anastasia's days. They weren't there for show. They ran things in Miami, in New York, and even across the river in parts of New Jersey. But Gambino's real edge was his friendship with Tommy Lucchese, boss of the old Galliano family. Galliano had died in '51, and Lucchese now ran the show. The Genovese outfit was supposed to be the enemy, but Vito Genovese himself, in 1959, still trusted Carlo. Genovese was in prison, but his friends, men like Mike Miranda, were close with Gambino. They knew him. They trusted him. That didn't mean Gambino was blind. He knew New Jersey was Genovese turf, solid from top to bottom. If he wanted in, he needed someone there to open the door. That's when the idea of taking out Abner Zwillman started to make sense. Zwillman had been a New Jersey institution, part gangster, part folk hero. Born 50 years earlier in Newark's 3rd Ward, he grew up in the slums. His father, an immigrant, died when Longie was 13. He quit school, drove a horse-drawn vegetable wagon to keep his mother and 6 siblings alive. Then came Prohibition. Bootlegging was the fast track, and Zwillman was one of the best. He ran rum from ocean-going ships, built a Newark syndicate that, according to reports, took in up to $20 million during the dry years. Longie laughed at the numbers, but never denied his status in America's liquor underworld. He said he got into it because his brothers and sisters were hungry, there were bills to pay, and in front of the Kefauver Committee in '51, he swore he wouldn't do it again for $10 million. The papers called him the Al Capone of New Jersey. He called that a myth. I walk into a restaurant, they say I own it. I walk into a hotel, they say I own it. I get a shine twice, I own the bootblack too. His legend was full of stories. When the Lindbergh baby was kidnapped in 1932, police were choking the bootlegging trade with roadblocks. Zwillman supposedly met with the kidnappers in a New York hotel and offered $50,000 to get the child back. The men were phonies, and Longie knew nothing about the baby's whereabouts. During the Depression, he paid for soup kitchens in Newark's Lincoln and military parks. In World War II, he bankrolled a canteen for servicemen and built a chapel at a veterans' hospital. Even in 1954, he was pushing a $1 million slum clearance project in his old neighborhood, putting up $250,000 of his own, and talking about eventually spending $100 million to house 12,000 families. I was born in the 3rd Ward on Waverly Avenue, he said. I've spent half my life there. If I can change things, I want to do it. For decades, Zwillman's name came up in federal investigations. He was tied by testimony to every big racket name in the country. New York DA William O'Dwyer called him one of Murder, Incan's 6 kingpins. Longie called that a stinking story. He was convicted only once, assault and battery in 1930, did 6 months in the Essex County Penitentiary, and swore he was innocent. He kept his distance from the spotlight. Married in 1939 to Mary de Groot Mendel Steinbach, a finishing school graduate from Milburn, he lived in a 20-room English manor in West Orange with their 2 children. His businesses were cigarettes, trucks, washing machines, scrap iron, steel, auto parts. He held stock in 2 major steel companies. The whispers never stopped, that he gave big to political campaigns, that in 1949 he helped bankroll John V. Kennedy's takeover of Jersey City from Frank Hague, that he offered $300,000 to gubernatorial candidate Elmer Wenney in exchange for picking New Jersey's Attorney General. Everyone denied it. Longie dismissed them as rumors. But, to Gambino, this wasn't folklore. This was an obstacle. Zwillman had the Garden State wired tight. The Genovese crew had no reason to share, and Longie's presence meant Gambino's men would never get a foothold. If Gambino wanted to expand Jersey operations, someone had to make a move. And in the underworld, moves like that didn't happen with meetings and memos. By the late 50s, the Jewish mob was on its knees. The old names had been shot, locked up, or were dying off. The survivors were aging fast, staring at a new breed of Italian gangsters who didn't sit down to talk percentages. These weren't the Meyer Lansky Lucky Luciano deal-makers of the 30s. These guys didn't negotiate. They slapped you, cleaned out your pockets, and kept walking. They didn't care about the old days. Most Jewish mobsters saw the writing on the wall. A few refused to fold. One of them was Abner Zwillman, an old-timer from the Luciano years, respected by Vito Genovese, respected by Lansky, respected by nearly everyone who mattered. But Zwillman didn't see that his clock was running out. In that world, a rumor could be a death sentence. And in the late 50s, rumors started to swirl. Tax problems, legal trouble. People whispered, could the old man handle a prison stretch? Or would he pull the oldest trick in the book and turn rat? Lansky wasn't around to help. He was watching Cuba collapse, scrambling to protect his brother from arrest and get his money out before Castro took it all. By 1959, Lansky was consumed with Havana. Longie was on his own. The trouble started with the tax case. In September 1955, federal prosecutors charged Zwillman with evading $46,100 in taxes for 1947 and 1948. They planned to use the net worth expenditure method, pointing to the costs of his West Orange mansion as evidence. His lawyers, John Toolan and Morris Shalensky, tried to force the government to itemize the alleged income, but Judge Thomas Meany backed the prosecution. They didn't have to name every source, just what was on his returns. The defense pushed for a list of people who supposedly spent Zwillman's money in 46 to 47, and argued over a deposition from the late Jules Endler, a Newark restaurant owner. The judge reserved decision until trial. January 56, the trial opened in Newark with an extra-large jury, 12 regulars and 4 alternates, because it was cold season and the proceedings were expected to drag on for 2 months. Zwillman sat in a conservative blue suit, calm and attentive. Jury selection wasn't easy. Several panel members admitted they already had an opinion about him and were excused. His lawyers had already lost 3 motions, one claiming the grand jury had improperly discussed the case with the U.S. Attorney's staff at a lawn party, another to inspect the grand jury minutes, and a third to see some of the prosecution's figures. Judge Rainier Wartendijk turned them all down, but ordered prosecutors to link any expenditures directly to Zwillman. The case ground forward, with Mrs. Wanda Miedzejewski of Jersey City picked as foreman. While the tax trial simmered, Zwillman's name still floated in the air over Washington. In March 1957, the Senate Labor Rackets Committee was making headlines. The Kefauver days were gone, but the committee still rolled out a rogues gallery: Jake Guzik, Tony Accardo, and, in earlier hearings, Zwillman himself. By 1959, Robert F. Kennedy was counsel, and the committee was digging into the jukebox and game machine rackets. It was a national operation, from New Orleans to Detroit, Miami to New York, with mob bosses using crooked unions and front companies to control everything from manufacturing to placement in candy stores. Lansky was subpoenaed in that probe, his first public grilling since the Kefauver hearings. He was expected to take the fifth again. Committee investigators named the key players in the eastern U.S. jukebox racket: Lansky, Zwillman, Tony Bender Strollo, Gerard Jerry Katina. Zwillman wasn't scheduled to testify, but he was on their radar. For Zwillman, none of this was abstract. He was still respected, still a name, but the ground was shifting. The Italians were moving in, the Jewish syndicate was fading, and now the Senate, the IRS, and the street were all watching. And in that life, when the whispers start and the sharks smell blood, There's no such thing as old friends. By 1959, the heat on Abner Longie. Zwillman was relentless. He'd been dragged into a Senate probe on the vending machine rackets, the same investigation that had just subpoenaed Meyer Lansky. His name had surfaced again alongside men like Gerard Jerry Katina, Tony Accardo, and Johnny Dio, mob bosses tied to the Teamsters insurance schemes. Paul Red Dorfman, a Chicago hood and Teamsters fixer, had been called before Robert Kennedy's Senate Rackets Committee. He took the fifth rather than talk about cutting deals with Hoffa, steering the union's fat insurance business to his family. Investigator James McShane testified that Dorfman was tight with Accardo, Dio, and Zwillman. On paper, it was just another name drop. On the street, it was more dangerous than that. That's when Longie made the move that sealed his fate. He'd started leaning on Carlo Gambino. Gambino had always played the part of the quiet boss, the man who rose to power by accident, not by force. It was an act, but a good one. Some men believed it. They thought they could muscle him. Zwillman was one of them. It was a mistake. The story in the underworld was that Gambino came to Longie's place himself. They worked him over. Nothing flashy, just body shots, wrapped in newspapers and magazines so they wouldn't leave bruises. Enough to hurt, not enough to bleed. Then they looped a rope around his neck and hung him like a slaughtered pig. It was a message. If you crossed Gambino, you'd find out what the quiet man was capable of. The rumor burned through the mob, from Luciano to the Jersey Crews. The papers told it another way. January 30th, 1959. West Orange police said Zwillman, 54, was found hanged in the basement of his 20-room English-style mansion at 50 Beverly Road. His wife Mary, a Milburn Junior League socialite, discovered the body. The Essex County Medical Examiner called it suicide, depression over the Senate jukebox investigation, and fresh jury tampering indictments tied to his 1956 tax trial. The official story was clinical. A plastic-covered clothesline, 44 feet long, strung over a beam 8 feet from the floor. His knees bent and his toes nearly touching. Nearby, a half-empty bottle of bourbon and a glass. His stepson, John Steinbach, told reporters Longie wasn't a drinker, just an occasional brandy man, and that what really weighed on him was the toll on his wife. The facts on the record, born in Newark's 3rd Ward in 1904. Rose from peddling vegetables to running a bootlegging syndicate worth tens of millions during Prohibition. Married into Milburn society in 1939, became a master at hiding his hand in legitimate businesses, dodged conviction for decades except for a 1930 assault and battery rap, survived every Senate committee and headline, the whispers on the street. He tried to strong-arm Carlo Gambino, and Gambino had him killed. Either way, by the end of that winter day in West Orange, Abner Zwillman, last of the great Jewish bootleg kings, respected by Lansky, feared by some Italians, envied by many, was gone. And with him went one more piece of the old underworld, replaced by the new order that didn't deal, didn't wait, and didn't forgive. In 1960, some of the biggest names in organized crime weren't Italian. They were Jewish. But unlike the Italians, the Jewish gangsters had no street crews waiting in the wings. They didn't recruit from the corners, didn't cultivate young soldiers. They were too busy running rackets, building businesses, and stacking real money. By the time they looked over their shoulders, they saw hungry young Italians moving in. When Longie Zwillman died, it signaled the beginning of the end for that old guard. One of the sharpest to see it coming was Nick Rosen, born Harry Stromberg. He wasn't just a player in Philadelphia's underworld, he helped build it. The unions, the narcotics trade, the gambling rackets. He had a piece of it all. He even controlled the city's garbage routes. And when muscle was needed, he pulled it in from New York. Rosen had been around long enough to know that the Luciano and Costello era was ending. He understood the rule: hand it over or get buried with it. He wasn't a fool. He had ties to Jimmy Blue Eyes Allo, Russell Bufalino, and Meyer Lansky. He cut a deal. He handed the Philadelphia operation to Angelo Bruno. All Rosen wanted was a cut of the take and the freedom to retire quietly in Miami, where he lived into old age. Even in retirement, he was the boss behind the boss, until time finally closed the book on him and a new name took the top spot: Angelo Bruno. Bruno was no street thug. He was a madman, head of his own family. But he inherited more than just territory. He inherited a network of killers, bookmakers, and racketeers who had been operating for decades. The Florida Crime Commission had them on paper: Max Big Shoey Siegel, lawbreaker since 1917, prison time for narcotics, Rosen's strong-arm man. Harry Siegel, his brother, a gambler with a dozen arrests since 1919. Samuel Litt, big-time bookmaker, Miami Beach fixture. John Whitey Rosen, ex-bootlegger, arrested 32 times. Jack Chinky Silver, Rosen enforcer, ex-con, violent, under investigation for years. Joseph Kocher, 39 arrests, gambling operator. Abe White, bookmaker, habitual arrestee. Joseph Herman, strong-arm, accused murderer, drug peddler. Abe Rothman, gambling in Dade County. Nathan Stromberg, Rosen's brother, kept watch on the Miami Beach interests. Tony Narcisi, enforcer, 33 arrests, dangerous addict. Harry Proven, from pickpocket to bookmaker. Jack and Mo Newman, Rosen's muscle. The commission's director, Dan Sullivan, didn't mince words. These men made their money in gambling, but would jump at any quick score: stick-ups, burglaries, armed robberies. They were smart, dangerous, and hard to prosecute. Rosen himself was no stranger to attention. In 1950 and 1951, he sat before the Kefauver Crime Committee, grilled for hours. His lieutenant, Willie Weisberg, testified too, though Weisberg clammed up when questions could get him indicted. The committee dug into Rosen's relationship with Assistant Superintendent of Police George F. Richardson. The questions came fast. Did Rosen take Richardson to the theater? Yes. Nightclubs? Yes. Prize fights? Yes. Expensive dinners? Yes. Rosen admitted giving the cop custom-made shirts from Sulkers, a dozen ties, and a $150 clock. He swore Richardson never did anything for him in return. Weisberg saw it differently. He called Richardson a smokescreen, a cop who hounded him while ignoring other crooks. He hinted at improper ties between Richardson and Buck Meyer, a sports promoter with his own shady connections. Richardson, for his part, didn't deny Rosen's status. On the record, he called him the Big Mahoff of the Philadelphia mob. He testified that Rosen had run the rackets since Prohibition: bootlegging, rum running, the numbers. In 1934, Richardson's men busted one of Rosen's headquarters in Upper Darby, finding 7 men and bushels of numbers slips. Rosen wasn't there, but the operation had his fingerprints all over it. When heat from a numbers racket probe came down, Rosen skipped to New York. Philadelphia police brought him back, but he beat the case. After that, he stayed in the shadows, slipping in and out of Philly, usually at night, still calling the shots through men like Weisberg. Richardson summed it up for the committee. Rosen had connections across the country. In Philadelphia, his word was law, and anyone who crossed him could expect an accident. By the time Rosen passed his empire to Bruno, the writing was on the wall. The Jewish bosses were fading out, the Italians were taking over, and the old streets were changing for good. In November 1957, Vito Genovese thought he was going to a party. At least, that's what he told the New York State Investigation Commission months later. The invitation had come from a man he knew only casually: Joseph Ida, 108, Lincoln Avenue, New Brunswick, New Jersey. Ida, an automobile salesman and Philadelphia mob boss, had stopped by Genovese's house in Atlantic Highlands on a Sunday. He was coming back from his Seaside Park summer home. The pitch was casual. There was a big businessman upstate, Joe Barbara, who might buy a few Cadillacs. Maybe, Ida said, Genovese could sell some steel. Genovese's business resume was a mix of legitimate and not. A steel fabricating plant in Amityville, the herb strapping company in New York City, interests in dog tracks, nightclubs, liquor distribution, power plants in Italy, and Italian policy operations in New Jersey. He hesitated. It's an awful ride, he told Ida. Ida countered. They'd fly up and back the same day. On the morning of November 14th, Genovese's son-in-law, Pasquale Simonetti, drove him to Newark Airport. Waiting there were Ida and Dominic Olivetto. On the plane, Mike Miranda, an old friend, and Jerry Catena. Genovese hadn't expected to see Miranda. "Where are you going?" he asked. "To see Barbara," Miranda replied. They landed in Binghamton, 5 men in all, and drove a half-hour to the Barbara estate. Their driver was unknown to Genovese. Conversation in the car was limited to weather and scenery. When they arrived, they were told Barbara had suffered a heart attack and might not make it. Genovese claimed he felt bad about the news, but he still took a sandwich. It was a steak sandwich, he testified later. Ida went inside for about an hour. When it was over, they left in a car driven by Russell Bufalino. By then, state police were swarming the property. 60 underworld figures were detained. Most gave nothing but name, rank, and serial number. Some, like Vincent Rao, insisted they were just there at a friend's urging. Joseph Magliocco later told an immigration investigator he'd gone for a few steaks. When the heat came down, Ida's story shifted. To Highland Park, Police Chief Alfred Smalley, he said he'd driven up with a man from Camden he didn't know. To IRS agent John Gelkion, he said he flew up with Olivetto. To a Mercer County grand jury in December 1957, he claimed he'd been sick for 10 days and was coaxed into going like a little dog on a chain. Olivetto had told him it was just a picnic in the country. "I spent my time sitting in a chair like a dummy," Ida said. "Everybody was eating." The federal government wasn't buying it. Ida was indicted, along with 20 others, for conspiring to obstruct justice by refusing to explain the real purpose of the Appalachin meeting. By May 1959, he was gone, believed to be in Italy. His disappearance left a vacuum in Philadelphia. Angelo Bruno, armed with Russell Bufalino's advice about keeping enemies close instead of killing them, was ready to fill it. A reporter once put it perfectly. "I must have written about Angelo Bruno 1,000,000 times when I was a general assignment man, but I never knew the guy. Once in Marie's luncheonette at 9th and Christian, we exchanged a quick hello. I didn't even know who he was. Somebody leaned over and said, 'You know Angelo.' I said, 'Angelo who?' They said, 'Angelo Bruno.' That's how it was in this town. You wrote about him, but you didn't know him. Half the press corps couldn't pick him out of a lineup." In Philadelphia, Bruno was the ready-made villain, the mob boss. Alleged, reputed, so-called. He never took a felony pinch. The cops who chased him his entire life never even caught him picking flowers out of season. But he was still the face of organized crime in the city. Bruno wasn't without sin, but he had something almost extinct in the new culture: discipline. For over 25 years from the time he inherited the title from Marco Reginelli, Philadelphia didn't see the kind of body count other cities did. No wild shootouts, no blood in the gutters. He kept it clean. That took control, both over his men and himself. His cat and mouse with law enforcement was legendary. The FBI, Captain Clarence Ferguson's vice squad, political investigators, none of them could get ahead of him. He never had a phone in his house. I didn't trust it. Conducted business from payphones scattered across South Philly, driving investigators crazy. And when New Jersey called him to testify about organized crime and gave him immunity, he still refused to talk. He did 3 years for contempt rather than break the code. That was Bruno. Never ratted, never talked. The discipline of a monk, the loyalty of a soldier. Nobody in the civil liberties crowd took up his cause. In an age obsessed with rights, no one defended a man's right to keep his mouth shut. The Bruno story started before him, with the city's first real boss, Salvatore Sabella. Tied to the Profaci Syndicate, Sabella's rackets ran through olive oil, cheese, and fresh produce, hooked into Boston and the New Orleans mob, which controlled exotic fruit coming into the US. Sabella had young up-and-comers in his crew. One was Angelo Bruno. By the 30s, Sabella retired quietly to Pennsylvania, maintaining ties with Russell Bufalino and Stefano Magaddino. Leadership passed to Joseph Ida after John Avina was murdered in 1936, the same year Lucky Luciano went to prison. Ida had been underboss to Giuseppe Dovi, who died in 46, leaving Ida as boss. Ida's name came up in one of the most infamous gatherings in mob history, the 1957 Appalachin meeting in upstate New York. Alongside national bosses like Vito Genovese, Jerry Katina, and Anthony Riella, Ida represented Philadelphia. Law enforcement later learned that inside Joseph Barbara's estate, mob delegates held a kangaroo court on Carmine Lombardozzi, a Brooklyn racketeer tied to the jukebox industry. Lombardozzi was supposed to be killed for crossing into another man's territory. Instead, the bosses fined him $10,000 and sent him home. The Senate Rackets Committee later heard how New York's Teamster Local 266, a racket in itself, was a tool for the associated machine operators to muscle small jukebox owners. Eli Casper, a former insider, testified how the Jacobs brothers, Eugene running the union, Herbert running the association, planned to corner the entire coin machine market in New York, Westchester, Nassau, and Suffolk. They used pickets to drive independents under, promising big payouts to insiders. Brooklyn operator Benjamin Gottlieb told how Miami Phil Corbisiero tried muscling him out. Lombardozzi got involved, using his labor consultant status to manipulate waterfront contracts and even collect inflated rent on a surplus army generator. Senator John F. Kennedy called it what it was, a payoff front. In the middle of all this national intrigue, Philadelphia kept its own steady hand at the tiller. When Ida stepped aside, the crown landed on Bruno's head. And for the next quarter-century, through wiretaps, surveillance tales, Senate hearings, and endless front-page accusations, Bruno never broke stride. No wild moves, no rash violence, just a quiet, steady grip on a city's underworld until the night it all came to an end. Angelo Bruno had reached far beyond Philadelphia. One of his closest allies was Russell Bufalino, who in turn was wired into Santo Trafficante in Tampa, Carlos Marcello in New Orleans, and the Detroit Partnership. These men were more than bosses of cities. They were shareholders in a Caribbean empire. The jewel in that empire was Cuba. By the mid-1950s, it was an island of palm trees, nightclubs, and high-end casinos, a criminal paradise run with an iron hand. The mob's grip was so tight that Meyer Lansky held a diplomatic post from the Cuban government. That gave him diplomatic immunity anywhere in the world. He never used it to carry drugs or cash, but the fact he could fly into any country without a customs search told you everything about his standing. Through 1958, money poured in. Rich Cubans, American corporations, and underworld investors saw Havana as a gold mine. Carlo Gambino took Trafficante's advice and sank hundreds of thousands into the island, $2.76 million in today's money. Lansky, Luciano, and half the American underworld followed suit, buying into casinos, hotels, and real estate. It wasn't just mobsters. Cuba's economy was a joint venture between organized crime and powerful lobbyists with friends in Washington. They saw themselves as the Washington Mafia, men who could put presidents in office, install dictators, or take them down. And like any mob, when a boss stopped following orders, they paid him a visit. By late 1958, everyone knew Batista's time was up. Fidel Castro's rebels were closing in, and the American business class wanted a smooth exit that would protect their holdings. William Pauly, a businessman-spy hybrid with 30 years of ties to Batista, got the job. Born in South Carolina, raised partly in Cuba, Pauly had built an aviation empire in China and India, owned Havana's streetcars, and had investments across the Caribbean. He was tight with Eisenhower, close to CIA Director Allen Dulles, and no stranger to mob contacts. In November 1958, the White House sent Pauly to Havana with CIA Station Chief Jim Knowle and Latin America Division Head L.C. King. Their mission? Convince Batista to step down for a moderate military junta. Batista said no. The mob made the same pitch. Lansky, Trafficante, and others told Batista the game was over. Leave now. He refused them too. 3 weeks later, on December 31st, 1958, Batista boarded a plane out of Havana just before midnight. For Gambino, the fallout was immediate. Trafficante had pushed him to invest in Cuba in '58 while prices were low. Now Gambino saw the hustle. Everyone in Havana had known the clock was ticking. In the final days before Castro took the capital, mob money flooded the island, either shoring up properties or buying out desperate owners. It almost got Lansky and Trafficante killed. They survived with help from Gambino, Bufalino, and Marcello. January 1st, 1959, Castro's forces swept into Havana. They smashed the casinos, symbols of the old regime, and outlawed gambling overnight. By February, he briefly reopened some to keep workers paid, but the writing was on the wall. Trafficante got the message directly. Castro told him to his face, "You're finished here." His friendship with Batista's brother-in-law, Roberto Fernandez Miranda, made him too radioactive to stay. Trafficante tried to play a shell game, selling the San Souci casino to Eufemio Fernandez Ortega, a former secret police chief under President Prio. Castro didn't buy it. On April 13th, he shut the place down. Still, Trafficante stayed. He thought he could ride out the revolution. On May 6th, the hammer fell for good. By 1959, Gambino was still in New York when it all started coming apart. The news hit fast. Jake Lansky got picked up. Then more arrests, one after another. Finally, Trafficante. Havana was spinning out. Gambino didn't know where to look first. The McClellan Committee hearings, still grinding away in New York, or the collapse of Cuba. The press had a new obsession. The mobsters trapped in Havana. Trafficante. Others. What Gambino didn't see was the other circle already moving in the south. Names he didn't know. David Ferry, Jack Ruby, the arms smuggling network. They were gearing up to buy their way past Castro. In the meantime, Lansky's people were getting squeezed. Jake Lansky and Dino Cellini, both tied to Havana's casino scene, were busted on drug charges. Trafficante disappeared. A month later, one of his men was caught offering a $4,000 bribe to a top Cuban cop to make the manhunt go away. John Martino wasn't so lucky. The FBI had been watching him since the 30s, gambling, bootlegging, extortion, maybe worse. He'd moved from Atlantic City to Miami, deep into the gambling rackets. By the mid-50s, he was supplying Havana casinos with rigged equipment and muscle. Martino could stop a roulette wheel on command. He had a system to get horse race results to bookies before the track announced them. After Castro took power, Martino flew to Havana in January. Half a dozen trips back and forth to Miami, smuggling cash out of Cuba. Then in July, he pushed too far. flew in with his 12-year-old son and got nailed trying to smuggle anti-Castro operatives out of the country. A Cuban doctor treating Martino told the FBI the guy was close to Trafficante and tied to Batista loyalists like Rolando Masferrer. Martino even offered the doctor a job, house physician at a brothel he planned to open. His trial didn't come until December. Trafficante kept working his angles. He reached out to Americans inside Castro's army, maybe Frank Sturgis, maybe soldier of fortune William Morgan. On June 9th, Cuban authorities arrested him. But this wasn't a regular bust. Instead of a prison cell, they sent him to Trescornia, the immigrant holding center. He had his own food, his own wine, and time to plot his next move. One of his cellmates was Loran Hall, ex-soldier, future operative. It was the start of a 2-decade relationship. Gambino was desperate for news out of Cuba. He wanted to know what money was getting out, and how much. He knew Russell Bufalino was working the angles. Every casino had been hit, Lansky, his people, others, emptying the tills. Cash was moved fast, loaded onto planes. Some men, like Martino, got grabbed. Others made it to New Jersey with the last scraps of Havana's gambling take. It wasn't many, just a few thousand here and there. The bosses were furious. This was the last payout they'd ever see from Cuba. If they wanted any chance of salvaging the operation or understanding how it collapsed, they needed Santo Trafficante out. Trafficante knew Havana like no one else. He'd stood outside his own casino and watched Raul Castro give wild, fire and brimstone speeches like a communist street preacher. If anyone could explain what went wrong and what could still be saved, it was him. His family was calling in favors everywhere, trying to get him out. Then Gambino got word. Someone had gone down to see him. When he heard who, he couldn't believe it. A Jew tied to the Chicago outfit, bankrolled by the Southern boys to make it happen. That's when the visit came that changed everything. Jack Ruby showed up. Ruby was still scratching out a living in Dallas, running the Vegas club. His partner, Joe Bonds, was already in prison for sodomy and white slavery. Ruby's own record was light. Liquor beefs, bar fights. But he hustled non-stop. He kept cops close by, putting them on the payroll as bouncers, keeping their glasses full. He was always short on cash, always borrowing. $1,000 here, $3,000 there, using his car as collateral. In early 1959, Ruby tried getting into the Cuban arms game. He went after Robert Ray McKeown, an ex-gun runner facing sentencing in Houston, now running a Seabrook drive-in with money from former Cuban President Carlos Prio. A sheriff brought McKeown a message. Someone needed to see him right away. Soon after, a man called himself Rubinstein. He wanted to ransom 3 Castro prisoners, $5,000 each, with Las Vegas money behind it. McKeown demanded cash up front. Ruby promised, never delivered. Weeks later, Ruby was back, pushing another deal, selling Castro a batch of Jeeps out of Shreveport. McKeown wanted $5,000 for a letter of introduction. Ruby vanished again. In 1978, McKeown confirmed it was Ruby both times. He hinted there were bigger players, Dallas mobsters Joe and Sam Campisi, whom Ruby knew well, tied to Prio's circle. The Jeep deal went nowhere, but Ruby learned something. Americans were still trapped in Cuba, and they were desperate. In March, he reached out to the FBI. Between March and October, he met with agents 8 times, offering himself as a source. He gave them nothing useful, but mob guys often make that move when they're about to take a big risk. Ruby told them nothing about Cuba. Still, by summer, he was moving in Havana circles, possibly through Pedro and Martin Fox, Cuban owners of the Tropicana Club. His old pal Louis McWillie worked there. Ruby later claimed he'd had dinner with one Fox brother and 2 Dallas lawyers with mob ties, David McCord and Alfred E. McLean. In May, a Dallas acquaintance named Elaine Minier flew to Havana. She'd worked with Ruby at National Car Rental. He gave her a coded message for McWillie. He was coming. McWillie's reaction: he's crazy. 6 weeks later, on July 1st, Ruby rented a safe deposit box in Dallas. He hit it often that summer. On August 8th, a Cuban tourist card put him in Havana. He stayed 10 days, visiting Trafficante, still held at Trescornia, multiple times. A British journalist, Jonathan Hudson, arrested in the same sweep that caught Loran Hall, told the CIA he'd seen Luis Santos, Trafficante, living well inside the camp, getting regular visits from an American gangster type named Ruby. Trafficante walked on August 18th, 10 days after Ruby arrived. Ruby left too. By August 21st, he was back in Dallas, at the safe deposit box again. August 31st, he met the FBI, never mentioned Cuba. He was back at the box September 4th, then gone again. That Labor Day weekend, Chicago mob guys spotted him at the Tropicana. On September 11th, he was in Miami, meeting Dallas gambling man Meyer Lansky. The next day he flew to Havana. On the 13th, he was in New Orleans. Looks like he was moving cash, just like Martino. Only Martino got 13 years for trying to smuggle a Nazi war criminal out. Ruby walked free. While casino owners scrambled to grab what they could carry, other American operators were already hedging their bets. Hedging their bets was all they had left. Bribery was second nature. Castro needed resources, money, medicine, materials, and the mob figured they could buy him like anyone else. In the mountains they'd even helped him. Arms, munitions, drug shipments, run in by smugglers like David Ferry, Jack Ruby and others, were dropped to his forces through multiple channels. The Mafia was betting on both sides. When Castro took Havana, some thought they could turn him. Jimmy Hoffa was one of them. Even with the Senate committee hearings breathing down his neck, he looked for a back channel, any way to get Castro to back men like Trafficante, Carlos Marcello, and others. Hoffa was ready to use the Teamsters as leverage, pulling him toward Washington instead of Moscow. At the time, America still didn't know what to make of Castro. Some were already calling him a communist. Others were hoping he'd flip, ally with the United States. Arcos Dynami, an Ohio outfit that had once financed surplus planes for Batista, moved early in '59, offering aircraft to Castro's new regime. Dominic Bartone and his crew even flew to Havana, trying to close the deal. Then the press caught wind of the Teamster connection. Hoffa's name was in print. Under heat from the Senate Rackets Committee and Robert Kennedy, the Teamsters backed off, at least in public. Years later, Edward Partin, the government's star witness against Hoffa, spelled it out. The whole thing was Hoffa's way of helping his mob buddies get their money out of Cuba. They were trying to win points with Castro. America wasn't taking Castro seriously. But Meyer Lansky, Carlos Marcello, Santo Trafficante, and the other heavy hitters were. They found a willing partner in another dictator, General Rafael Trujillo of the Dominican Republic. Trujillo was a friend organizing crime, especially Lansky, Marcello, and Trafficante. The Dominican Republic was also a safe haven for United Fruit, the giant with deep ties to the New Orleans mob and the men behind the CIA. Trujillo and his allies took Castro seriously. They wanted him gone. The plan formed quietly. Work with Batista loyalists, smuggle weapons into the Dominican Republic, train soldiers, and prepare either to kill Castro or invade Cuba outright. The guns came from Pennsylvania, Galveston, and Dallas, shipped to New Orleans, flown to the Dominican Republic through Guatemala. No waiting for Washington's blessing. These operators moved without it. But they made a rookie mistake. They talked too much. The kind of operation that needed to live in the shadows started leaking into daylight. The word was out. If Castro wouldn't play ball, they'd put him in the ground. By May, Dominic Bartone had switched sides. He set up an arms deal with Batista loyalists inside Trujillo's regime. On May 22nd, Bartone and several others were arrested in Miami, caught loading a plane with weapons bound for the Dominican Republic. The charges: bribery, conspiracy, illegal arms, export. That July, while the plotters were still moving pieces, journalist William Atwood made another trip to Havana. Atwood wasn't green. Foreign correspondent, Look magazine editor, interviewed Castro before and after the revolution. Later, Kennedy would make him ambassador to Guinea. But in the summer of '59, Atwood walked into a cocktail party in Havana that felt like a war council. The house was elegant, the guests wealthy, and the Americans in attendance didn't bother lowering their voices. "There's a contract out on Castro," one told him. Atwood was even introduced to two men said to be the shooters. Julio Lobo, Cuba's sugar king and millionaire banker, told him flat out, Castro wouldn't see the year's end. Other guests said the Americans were CIA. The trail led back to the Dominican Republic, mob-connected Americans, and a wild card named William Morgan. Morgan had fought with Castro in the mountains, but now he was working both sides, maybe all three. Bartone was in touch with him by May. On July 30th, an FBI source in Havana said Morgan had taken $200,000 from the Dominican Consul General, with Bartone right there. The word was Morgan would kill Castro, then the invasion would begin. 2 decades later, ex-arms trafficker Edward Browder told the House Select Committee on Assassinations the same thing. Morgan was supposed to take Castro out at Cohima, a beach resort the Cuban leader loved. The CIA had given him the weapons, but Morgan flipped. He handed the guns and the cash to Castro. By early May, the FBI already knew about the Dominican plan. Among the sources, former Cuban police chief Manuel Benitez and lobbyist Irving Davidson. Davidson was Carlos Marcello's best friend and Washington fixer. On June 30th, Davidson met with the Bureau's assistant director, August Belmont, acting for Lobo. He made it clear, if the US wouldn't back their new anti-communist front, crack, they might have to throw in with Trujillo's invasion. On August 13th, the invasion collapsed. Morgan and Eloy Gutierrez Menoyo, still seen as Castro loyalists, had sold it out. Thousands of conspirators inside Cuba were rounded up. The first serious attempt to remove Castro ended in disaster. Morgan kept shifting sides until November. That month, Cuban police took him down for organizing guerrilla resistance. In 1960, he faced the firing squad. What most people don't realize is that before Castro ever cemented his grip on Cuba, there was already an invasion plan on the table, one the Mafia helped engineer. Long before the Bay of Pigs, the mob had lined up with Eisenhower's administration, pushing an operation to take the island back and restore the Havana racket that Fidel had ripped from them. The plan reached Vice President Richard Nixon, but it went nowhere. Eisenhower was on his way out of office and didn't want to leave behind a foreign policy firestorm for the next administration. The timing wasn't right, but the fact remains, the Mafia had already been running assassinations and invasion scenarios in tandem with elements of the CIA. When people talk about Cuba, they remember the Bay of Pigs in 1961. They don't remember that an earlier attempt was ready to go, with Mafia hands all over it. By then, Havana wasn't just Meyer Lansky's problem. Carlo Gambino, the Detroit mob, and Russell Bufalino were tied in. The American Mafia saw Cuba as too valuable to abandon. Their money was in the casinos, the hotels, the skim, and Castro had slammed the door. So, the mob pressed the CIA to move. Eisenhower agreed in principle, and Nixon was on board. But the president wasn't about to sign off on something he couldn't finish before leaving the White House. That meant the invasion, what history would later call the Bay of Pigs, would fall to whoever won the 1960 election. And that made the mob's choice between Nixon and Kennedy more than politics. It was business. Whoever signed off on Cuba would get Mafia support. In Washington, the picture took time to sharpen. At first, Castro's firing squads, lining up Batista loyalists and cutting them down, set off alarms. On February 12, 1959, CIA Director Allen Dulles told the National Security Council that Castro's endgame was bigger than Cuba. He wanted revolutions across Latin America. 2 months later, Castro came to the US. In April, Vice President Richard Nixon met him. Nixon liked what he saw. He called Castro a natural leader of men, someone who might still be guided toward America's interests. Then came May Day, and worse, the Agrarian Reform Law on May 17th. It was a death warrant for US-owned sugar lands in Cuba. The panic moved from the back rooms to the front offices. Nixon was caught between two power centers. One was the intelligence establishment. The other was organized crime. He'd been the mob's horse for years, connected to the Teamsters through Jimmy Hoffa and Tony Provenzano, tied to Russell Bufalino, Santo Trafficante, and Carlos Marcello. He couldn't bring back Luciano or Joe Adonis, but he'd been reliable. Under Eisenhower and Nixon, the White House had done almost nothing to stop organized crime. But Castro changed that relationship. When Nixon met him in April, the mob expected him to see a problem. Instead, they saw him blind to it. To men like Bufalino, Provenzano, and their peers, Nixon came off as a traitor or a fool. If he couldn't spot a communist in front of him, what good was he? They were already losing millions because of Castro, and now they'd have to spend millions more to get rid of him. Nixon's red on Castro cost him. In the mob's eyes, he was out of touch. They needed a new horse. That horse was already kicking at them, John F. Kennedy, with Robert Kennedy at his side. The brothers had made their names the way FDR once had with Samuel Seabury, cornering organized crime in hearings and headlines. But with Castro entrenched in Havana, the mob saw a chance to cut a deal. It wasn't Robert they went through. It was John, via Frank Sinatra, Joseph Kennedy, and a network of lawyers who could talk both languages. The deal was straightforward. The mob wanted the committee hearings shut down, already losing steam by the end of '59. Any laws or new legislation against them should be ignored. Deportations halted. And Kennedy had to back another invasion of Cuba, signing off on the one Eisenhower, Nixon, and Allen Dulles had already put in motion. Kennedy checked the boxes. Hands were shaken. The only mob figures who saw the double cross coming were Carlos Marcello in New Orleans, who stayed with Johnson and Nixon, and Jimmy Hoffa, who poured over $500,000 into Nixon's campaign to beat the Kennedys. But before any of it could be settled, Latin America started to boil over. As 1959 closed and 1960 opened up, the Kennedys were in the middle of a heated primary, preparing for an even bloodier showdown with Richard Nixon. In the shadows, the Mafia was deciding whose side to take. Sam Giancana in Chicago and Santo Trafficante in Florida had already made their choice. Trafficante, who had long-standing ties to Joseph Kennedy and his son John, leaned toward the Kennedys. But not everyone was sold. Down south, Carlos Marcello was the power. He ruled Louisiana, had reached Texas and Arkansas, and understood one basic truth. You couldn't win the White House without the South. Even Franklin Roosevelt had known it. That's why he picked Harry Truman and John Nance Garner as running mates. Eisenhower had Nixon. Now the CIA, along with certain New York mob figures, had been grooming Nixon for years. Roy Cohn was one of the connectors. He'd made himself useful during the McCarthy hearings. But when those collapsed, and his homosexuality was dragged into the open, he was ostracized by the establishment. That's when Carlo Gambino's people moved in. They knew Cohn's secrets and his grudges, and Gambino valued him as a man on the margins who had dirt, including on Robert Kennedy's allies from the McCarthy days. With Nixon and Cohn, Gambino felt he had Washington covered. Marcello saw it differently. He remembered Robert Kennedy's face during the Senate hearings, the pure anger in his eyes when he looked at him. What the mob underestimated was Robert's tenacity. He wasn't just another young senator's brother playing politics. He was connecting dots. Abe Reles, Murder Incorporated, the old hits of the 40s and 50s, even whispers of J. Edgar Hoover's deal with the mob to keep things quiet. Robert Kennedy wasn't going to let go. Gambino thought he'd escaped notice. Articles still centered on Luciano, Genovese, and Russell Bufalino. His name barely surfaced in print. He figured he'd gotten away with it. But Marcello, a veteran of the deportation games that had taken Luciano and Silver Dollar Sam, knew better. Deals with patricians never ended well. Joseph Kennedy had built his sons with family money. They didn't rely heavily on mob money, but they took it when they needed it, and once the deal was done, it stayed behind closed doors. John would never turn against Robert, and Robert was coming straight at them. So, Marcello played long. Louisiana was Democratic country, and he poured money into every level. District attorneys like Jim Garrison, senators, state men. The state was already bought and paid for by United Fruit, Big Oil, gambling, prostitution, narcotics, and Marcello himself. With Oni Madden dead and his Hot Springs empire fading, Marcello spread into Arkansas, Texas, and beyond. He was sitting on top of the Southern oil racket, and he saw Lyndon Johnson as the natural counterweight to the Kennedys. Marcello and his allies put money in front of Johnson, and he finally stepped into the race. But Kennedy had already worked the ground game: delegates, backroom deals, bribes, mob ties in New York, Chicago, and Florida. By the time Johnson tried to peel away delegates at the convention, it was too late. Kennedy had locked them down. Johnson finished second, and Kennedy picked him as his running mate, not realizing the weight of the Southern power bloc backing him. Robert Kennedy understood New York. He understood Chicago. He even had a grip on Florida. But Louisiana, Texas, Arkansas, that was outside his reach. He didn't see how deep the Southern networks ran. The CIA, FBI, IRS, and other agencies had been working with Marcello's world for decades. Since the 1860s, Louisiana's men had fought for their ground. Since the early 1900s, they had run it. And they knew exactly what kind of damage the Kennedys would do if they got power. Marcello and his people were already angry. The failed mafia-backed invasion of Cuba in 1959 had cost them millions. They had men like David Ferry and Jack Ruby on their payroll long before the public knew their names. By the time the Bay of Pigs was being planned, Marcello, Bufalino, Gambino, and Giancana were already in deep with the CIA. The relationship wasn't new. These were the same men who had worked with the OSS during World War II. The original intelligence shop that later became the CIA. To Marcello, that history mattered. It wasn't the CIA teaching them how to run operations. It was men like him teaching the CIA how the real underworld worked. The American Mafia was operating on a scale it had never before imagined. The vehicles were running. The hidden networks of fronts, couriers, and cutouts that moved money from the rackets into legitimate investments. And the crown jewel of those investments was Las Vegas. The dream first whispered by Benjamin Bugsy Siegel. Siegel, with his connections stretching coast to coast. Capone's Chicago outfit, Jack Dragner in Los Angeles, Mickey Cohen, even Carlos Marcello in New Orleans, had understood something no one else did. New Orleans could never keep open gambling forever. But in Nevada, it was legal. That meant the desert, not the bayou, was the future. Chicago became the first big player to pour in money. The outfit's position in Middle America, spread through Texas, Kansas City, and across the Midwest racing wires, made it easy to move cash and muscle west. The big strip casinos flourished, but so did the smaller joints scatter through Reno and dusty Nevada towns. These smaller houses, lightly watched, were where much of the real money laundering took place. New York's 5 families, Luciano's men, Adonis, Costello, Profaci, Galliano, Bonanno, later Lucchese, all poured millions into the desert through fronts. Siegel's Flamingo may have been the beginning, but by the mid-1950s, Vegas was a national syndicate project. Every family had a piece. But there was a problem. After the Kefauver hearings, banks refused to touch casino financing. The industry was stained as mobbed up, the books untrustworthy. Traditional credit was dead. That's where Jimmy Hoffa came in. Hoffa had a vision, the Teamster Central States Pension Fund. Once it was structured the way he wanted, it became the mob's private bank. Millions in union pension money could be moved into investments with the stroke of a delegate's vote. And those delegates, each one controlled by a crime family. It was democracy, mob style. A legitimate businessman could walk in with a plan, but unless he was backed by someone like Russell Bufalino or a Chicago boss, his pitch was worthless. The mob controlled the votes before they were cast. Small deals might be $60,000. Big ones ran $10 million, even $20 million. The Mafia became financiers, backing businessmen, laundering their own cash, and making sure the returns came back with interest. Las Vegas was the perfect outlet. Every major family in America had money buried in the desert. But their shares weren't neat percentages. They got a cut out of whatever casino their money went into. No more, no less. Once skimmed, the money was picked up by trusted men. Meyer Lansky's couriers, Jimmy Blue Eyes Allo, or women used to dodge security, and then divided up in New York, Miami, Chicago, Detroit, Buffalo, and beyond. Carlo Gambino, inheriting Albert Anastasia's investments, thought Vegas was a ripe orchard, but he didn't know the fruit was poisoned. By 1958, the FBI had already cracked parts of the system. They knew who picked up the envelopes, which couriers dropped them, which gangsters got paid. The Bureau was patient, holding it back, waiting for the right time. In 1967, Life magazine would blow the lid off the entire operation, naming names and exposing the skim. When that happened, the Mafia's financial architecture, carefully built for decades, would be crippled. But in 1959, the bosses didn't see it coming. To them, the world still looked like a blessed place. Vegas money was flowing. The Teamsters were their bank. Hoffa was their man. The rackets were feeding the casinos, and the casinos were feeding the Syndicate. They didn't yet know the decade ahead would bring catastrophe. War with Castro in Cuba, the loss of their Caribbean strongholds, political uprisings in Latin America, British crackdowns in the Bahamas, and federal investigations in the United States. What they had built in 30 years, an empire stretching from Havana to London, would be shattered in less than one. By 1959, they weren't celebrating. They were desperate. Desperate to turn the tide before history caught up with them. By early 1959, the decision to topple Fidel Castro was already moving forward, and it would soon have the blessing of the highest levels of the Eisenhower-Nixon administration. The formal go-ahead came that March, when the Special Group 5412 Committee approved a CIA plan to remove Castro and install a regime acceptable to the US. The blueprint would be run primarily by Nixon's network inside the agency, including future Watergate figure E. Howard Hunt. Hunt, along with other operatives such as Bernard Barker and Eugenio Martinez, names that would later resurface in the Watergate scandal, helped mold the exile leadership into a political and military force aimed at a Cuban invasion. The operation wasn't just about propaganda and guerrilla training. It also had a darker undercurrent. As the CIA expanded its exile army, eventually christened Brigade 2506, Its paramilitary wing opened training sites across the hemisphere, with the main base in Guatemala. Political coordination was messy, but Nixon's hardliners kept the machinery running, grooming exile leaders like Manuel Artime, while sidelining those they considered unreliable. Meanwhile, another arm of the plan was moving in parallel: the assassination of Fidel Castro. By mid-1960, the CYA had turned to organized crime for help. John Roselli of Los Angeles, Sam Giancana of Chicago, Carlos Marcello of New Orleans, who was also working with other far-right elements of the CIA, Carlo Gambino of New York, Russell Bufalino of Pennsylvania, Joe Stasi of the Havana mob, Jimmy Blue Eyes, Meyer Lansky, the Dallas Mafia, and Santo Trafficante, Cuba's former mob boss, were all quietly recruited. The logic was cold. These men had the contacts, muscle, and plausible deniability to make Castro disappear. By the time Eisenhower left office in January 1961, the Bay of Pigs invasion force was nearly ready, the mob was on the payroll, and Nixon's operatives, many destined for future notoriety, were embedded at every level. The through line from this covert war in Cuba to later scandals like Watergate was already being written in the shadows. Carlo Gambino had heard the stories about Luciano for years, that he worked with naval intelligence in the war, that he had Hoover in his pocket, that he controlled the world narcotics trade. To a young Gambino, still climbing in the 1940s, it all sounded like myth. But once he sat at the head of the table in the late 50s, he began to see what was real and what wasn't. Luciano had been powerful, no question. But his empire, like all the Mafia's power, rested on something more than guns and fear. It rested on necessity. Gambino was necessary because the elites of New York needed him. The garment industry, Manhattan's lifeblood, could not function without his say-so. If a manufacturer wanted to cut costs, he needed non-union shops, which were all quietly owned, brokered, or protected by Gambino's men. If he wanted to block a rival, he needed union shops, also controlled by Gambino or Russell Bufalino, or another boss. Construction was the same. Cheap labor, no strikes, materials moved in and out, all guaranteed by the Mafia. For that guarantee, the families took shares in the buildings themselves. Everything that moved in New York was under their grip. Trucking and freight carried newspapers, fruit, meat, alcohol, and every load had to pass through their network. The waterfronts, the docks, shipping, all locked down, ensuring that corporations like United Fruit had their cargo loaded, unloaded, and protected. Competition could be unionized into oblivion while favored clients stayed free. Waste disposal, rigged bids, all run through Gambino and Lucchese. Meat and poultry? Controlled. The bread in the morning, the milk in your coffee, all touched by mob hands. Slot machines, jukeboxes, pinball. Every coin your kids dropped at an arcade ended up in a mob ledger. Fast food chains, nightclubs, cigarette machines, liquor distributors, laundry, dry cleaners, parking garages, stagehands, theatrical unions, janitors, doormen, elevator operators. If New York lived off it, Gambino and the Commission took a slice. To the industrial elite, the mob was indispensable. They were enforcers, keeping labor in line, keeping factories open, keeping the flow smooth. But over time, the roles reversed. The bosses became the ones at the head of the table, with the so-called legitimate businessmen dependent on them for survival. The mob bailed them out, bought their shares, turned their failures into rackets. By the late 50s, the Mafia wasn't just in business. It was the system. Which is why, when the CIA came calling, they had no choice but to work with them. Organized crime offered something no government agency could manufacture on its own: plausible deniability. If an operation went bad, Washington could claim they had no idea these honorable businessmen were criminals. After all, J. Edgar Hoover himself never admitted the Mafia existed. The arrangement worked. The FBI would go after soldiers and captains, but the bosses, Lucchese, Gambino, Accardo, Marcello, Trafficante, Lansky, Costello, Luciano, lived and died as free men. Not untouched, but never brought down. But while the bosses kept their heads down, Luciano couldn't resist the spotlight. Since 1957, his name was splashed across headlines: the exile in Naples, the whispers about narcotics, the accusations that he was the hidden hand behind Costello's near assassination and Anastasia's murder. He hated it. He wanted to tell his side, and he began speaking to journalists, authors, anyone who would listen. He talked about Tom Dewey, his old nemesis, the man who deported him. He thought he was venting old grudges. What he didn't realize was that by dragging Dewey's name back into the light, he was brushing up against something larger. Dewey had been one of the first establishment Republicans to back the CIA. He had mentored men like Nixon, and his network ran deep into Washington. Luciano thought he was safe. In 1951, maybe he was. But by 1959, coming into 1960, the Kennedys were on the rise, and Robert Kennedy was making it his life's work to expose exactly the kind of deals Dewey, Hoover, Cohn, Nixon, and the mob had struck. The game was changing, and for the first time in decades, the bosses were no longer untouchable. Charlie Luciano's mourning for Igea was over. The world wouldn't let him sit in peace anyway. In the States, the plot to bury Vito Genovese was done. His trial, conviction, and sentencing were set game and match. He locked up in 1959, but still the Genovese family and his inner circle was trouble, pushing into Joe Bonanno's Brooklyn turf, stirring the kind of tension that could turn into a shooting war. The other commission bosses wanted Luciano to step in, calm things down. Fidel Castro had taken Havana, kicking out Fulgencio Batista and knocking the legs out from under Meyer Lansky's casino empire, which left Luciano fuming. Lansky pivoted fast, shifting money into the Bahamas, the Dominican Republic, and Las Vegas. With Luciano's and the council's blessing, he funneled millions into Vegas, building it into a gambling fortress. He stayed loyal to Batista, moving millions into Swiss banks, investing even in communist Yugoslavia. The crises pulled Luciano back into his old rhythm: dinners at the California, afternoons at Z Teresa, nights with friends, the occasional woman. That's how Adriana Rizzo came into the picture. A young shopgirl from Naples, she'd met Charlie a couple of years earlier when he came in for a medical back brace. One afternoon she walked past his table at the Santa Lucia, and before long she was in his apartment, part nurse, part lover. Her family didn't care about marriage. Luciano helped them when he could. Adriana and his friend Lydia got along fine. But outside his home, the US was boiling. New Jersey, Manhattan, Brooklyn, all edging toward an Italian mafia-style cold, but soon to be open war. Lansky was bouncing around the Caribbean, worrying about Cuba. Luciano, feeling the pull of unfinished business, went north to Milan for a quiet sit-down with Joe Adonis. It was a waste. It was like talking to the wall, Luciano said later. Adonis was living easy, running an import-export front, moving stolen jewelry, and not offering Luciano so much as, "Do you need anything?" Charlie left Milan convinced Adonis was a selfish cocksucker. Back in Naples, Adriana's youth began to take its toll. A month after she moved in, Luciano had a mild heart attack. Dr. Matteoli brought in a cardiologist, Dr. Di Martine. "If you keep this up," the doctor warned, "you'll drop dead." Adriana forced him into bed rest. When he tried to get frisky, she smacked him hard enough to leave a lump. Within weeks he was back in the clubs, at the Agnano racetrack, losing money on horses. He turned his attention to a failing furniture business and helped build Father Scarpato's clinic near Vesuvius. Then, in late spring, the big one hit, a massive coronary. Hospitalized for a month, Luciano realized the doctor had been right. At 62, the stress from New York could kill him. He called Chinky Vitality to the hospital. The plan: retire from the Unione, take a pension, and let the council pick a new chairman. He figured Carlo Gambino was the natural choice. Just tell them to send me my dough and leave me alone, he told Chinky. Lansky got the message first. He controlled the money. But the dough came with strings. The visits and questions never stopped. Luciano admitted it felt good to be needed, so he stayed in the loop. Still, money was tight. Hospital bills for Igea had drained him. He wanted $60,000 to set up an old neighborhood friend, Coppola, in a candy and ice cream shop in Naples. The money never came. He tapped a Swiss laundry account, but still couldn't make it happen. He stopped answering couriers from New York. Italian police and his lawyer, Giovanni Passeggio, believed him when he said he was retired. Passeggio convinced officials Luciano was as inactive in the US as he was in Italy. The press even began painting him as a harmless old man on a park bench. Still, he burned over that $60,000. That's when the movie idea came back. He'd always said no to producers, but in the summer of '59, a New Yorker made him a deal. $100,000 cash when shooting started, 10% of the profits, and the right to kill the project if he didn't like it. By October in Capri, Luciano signed the option. It was supposed to be the payday he'd been waiting for. But as soon as the ink was dry, New York was pressing him again. By the end of the '50s, Carlo Gambino was settling into the city he now controlled. He knew this was a new era, and a dangerous one. Vito Genovese might be locked up in Atlanta, but his crew was still loaded with hard, cold killers, all well connected. Luciano and Joe Adonis were exiled in Italy, and plenty of Luciano's old guard had been wiped out. That left openings and threats. In 1959, Vincent Squillante was murdered in revenge for the killing of Frank Scalise and his brother. Soon after, Augie Carfano, another Luciano loyalist, was taken out by the Genovese family. Gambino's position at the top was already under pressure. It wasn't like when Luciano took down Maranzano with the full blessing of the commission. Gambino, Lucchese, and Genovese had eliminated Anastasia, Mangano, Scalise, Carfano, and multiple others without unanimous approval. Everyone knew what treachery New York mobsters were capable of. The botched peace meeting at Appalachin in '57 had been raided by the cops, humiliating the New York bosses and unleashing a federal war on organized crime. Robert Kennedy, as Attorney General, was coming hard. Gambino knew any move he made now needed the backing of bigger players with deep influence, men like Luciano. In Sicily, Luciano was working with Bonanno connections and watching the Sicilian Mafia grow closer to the American families. Genovese already had his hooks in. Italy was becoming a hub for mob investment, and ambitious gangsters were flying back and forth, cutting deals, betraying allies, and even handing each other over to US authorities. It was a Cold War inside the Mafia. Luciano, Gambino, Lucchese, Marcello, Trafficante, Accardo, and others agreed on a vision: clean up the unions, legitimize them, use the money to fund real businesses, and slowly get out of the rackets. But after Appalachin, the rules had changed. The mob was in the spotlight. Hollywood was churning out gangster films. TV was piping mob stories into American living rooms. Now there was The Untouchables. All gangsters on screen were Italian, feeding anti-Italian sentiment. In mid-October 1959, Pat Eboli arrived in Naples with money and messages. The commission wanted Luciano's advice on a brewing war in Brooklyn over the sickly Joe Profaci. Genovese, from prison, suspected Luciano had helped put him there and was telling Tommy, Eboli, and Jerry Katina he wanted Charlie dead. Eboli also brought news about the Untouchables. Joe Colombo had floated the idea of a legitimate-sounding group to push back, an association of Italian Americans to protest the show and boycott its sponsor, Chesterfield Cigarettes. Luciano liked the plan on one condition: no mob-connected names. He picked Congressman Alfred Santangelo to front it. By March 1961, the pressure worked. Liggett and Myers pulled its sponsorship. Santangelo knew from the beginning the whole thing was dreamed up and supported by the outfits, Luciano later said. But the envelope Eboli handed over was light. Lansky was cutting Luciano's take, claiming Cuba's fall had gutted the treasury. Charlie knew better. London casinos and new Bahamian operations were pulling in millions. Meanwhile, Siragusa was out of Italy, replaced by Henry Manfredi, a CIA-linked operator. Manfredi sent in Major Mike Chera to cozy up to Luciano, fishing for intel. Luciano played along, inviting him to his farm, knowing the game couldn't last. Adriana stayed loyal, even as doctors warned Luciano to ease up on romance for his heart's sake. He suggested she leave. She refused. By fall, Luciano's interest in a movie deal had cooled. The producer's script felt like a tired 30s gangster flick. Then Martin Gosch appeared. A former Hollywood producer, Gosch pitched a story about Luciano's exile years. Charlie liked him. He'd written for Abbott and Costello, which Luciano used to listen to in prison. Gosch's script was fiction. An exiled gangster, an Italian romance, a diary with all his secrets, and ties to real events like the hits on Frank Costello and Albert Anastasia. Luciano signed on, giving Gosch veto-proof control but reserving the final word. Money from New York kept shrinking. Luciano had less to hand out to the deportees and broke women in Naples who relied on him. All over the world, I was the big white slaver, he said. Here I am giving them money just so they can eat. Short on funds, he started avoiding them. He told Eboli to inform Lansky and the rest that the film would be harmless to anyone still active. They gave the go-ahead. By December, Gosch and English writer John Cresswell had a full outline. Luciano liked it even more when Gosch hinted he might get him back into New York, legally, to sue CBS over a Your Witness episode that used his name without approval. The lawsuit might get tossed, but it would require his presence in court. Luciano jumped at it. When Gosch asked who should play him, Luciano's first choice was Cary Grant. Then he suggested Dean Martin. Gosch had no connection, but Luciano said, "Don't worry about that." He sent scripts to Hollywood, one to Frank Sinatra to hand to Martin. Gosch left for Europe to line up financing and a newspaper syndication deal. Luciano stayed in Naples, waiting. By the time 1959 closed out, the decade had buried itself in blood and power plays. For Carlo Gambino, it had been one hell of a run. In 1951, his closest friend, Tommy Lucchese, had become boss. Not long after, the Mangano brothers disappeared, leaving Gambino with a clear shot at the top. By the end of the 50s, Carlo was sitting on the throne of organized crime in New York, but control was never clean. He'd survived deportations, indictments, and a body count that stretched from Willie Moretti to Longie Zwillman. And still, the city was slipping into chaos. Joe Profaci was old, his grip weakening. Inside his family, the Gallo brothers were already stirring rebellion. Gambino fanned the flames, feeding the discontent, grooming men like Joseph Colombo to rise from the cracks. Even Lucky Luciano, watching nervously from Italy, understood where it was heading. Bosses were being clipped left and right. Albert Anastasia gunned down. Augie Carfano taken out. Once solid allies of Luciano cut from the board. Vito Genovese and Frank Costello sat in prison, while Gambino, Lucchese, Bonanno, and Profaci struggled to carve control of New York. Meanwhile, Havana was gone. Castro had slammed the doors on their gambling empire. Miami was burning under press heat. And in 1960, when Castro came to New York, visiting Harlem, Gambino looked at him from a distance and thought, "Why isn't this bastard dead already?" Profaci's people were restless. He poured money into his own family and the church while starving his men. Gambino kept his eyes on the gallows, drawing them close, using them as his spies inside Profaci's crew. The gallows caused the trouble, and Carlo pulled the strings. Anthony Strollo was dispatched to mediate the civil war inside Profaci's family, but Tony Bender played both sides, cutting his own deals. That kind of maneuvering drove Gambino and the others crazy. Even with New York on the verge of open war, the bosses needed Washington. They needed someone in the White House who'd protect them. Nixon had met Castro, and that alone had soured the mob on him. Santo Trafficante hated him. Giancana and the Chicago outfit were already pushing hard for John F. Kennedy. Sinatra lined up with them, bringing other Italian singers with him, drowning out Nixon's voice on the airwaves. Kennedy looked young, clean, and sharp on television. Nixon looked like he was sweating out a fever. Not everyone trusted the Kennedys. Jimmy Hoffa and Carlos Marcello hated them. Marcello cut Nixon a check for $250,000. Hoffa matched it. Two gangsters putting $500,000 behind Nixon. But Kennedy won anyway. And the minute he got into office, he saw exactly what those contributions were. Mob money. He declared war. For Gambino, the 60s were going to be different. Costello, Luciano, Adonis, Anastasia. They'd operated in an era when J. Edgar Hoover denied organized crime even existed. Police commissioners, senators, even journalists all pretended the mafia was a myth, while taking envelopes under the table. Plausible deniability. That disappeared the moment Kennedy moved in. Gambino thought a Kennedy White House might still work. Hoover would keep his job. Allen Dulles would keep running the CIA. Harry Anslinger would keep the Narcotics Bureau. Those three had always been useful idiots. Dulles ran coups overseas with the mafia's help, using Sicilians, Corsicans, anyone who could get the job done. Hoover's private life left him compromised, and Gambino was smart enough to exploit it. As soon as he became boss, he ordered his men into the gay bars, the clubs, the backrooms. The old guard hated it. Anastasia, the Manganos, none of them wanted to go near that world. But Gambino saw leverage. He wanted lists, which lawyers were gay, which judges, which politicians, which kids were using drugs. He built blackmail files that could choke a city. It was a move straight out of Carlos Marcello's New Orleans playbook. When Roy Cohn's name surfaced, Gambino had him followed, staked out, photographed, caught in compromising situations. They brought him in quietly, sat him down, and showed him what they had. From that moment, Cohn belonged to Gambino. And with Cohn, Bobby Kennedy was kept at arm's length. Blackmail kept Carlo untouchable. For the next 16 years, no politician dared deport him. No prosecutor could bring him down. He had their secrets in his pocket. Unlike Luciano, Costello, and Adonis, Gambino wanted a return to the old Sicilian way. A family bound by blood, honor, loyalty, and capitalism. Only Sicilians could rise to the top. Others could be soldiers, earn their money, but the crown stayed Sicilian. He tied New York to Palermo, making sure that a strike against Gambino, Lucchese, Marcello, Trafficante, Paul Ricca, Giancana, the Cleveland Mafia, Russell Bufalino, Stefano Magaddino, or Bonanno in America meant war with the Sicilians back home. And if someone touched the men in Sicily or Corsica, as well as other parts of Europe and the globe without permission, then they had to answer to New York, Chicago, and the Southern Hemisphere. Two worlds, one family. That was Carlo Gambino's empire. The sit-down in Miami was different. This wasn't the usual New York power shuffle. This was the big table. Carlo Gambino looked around and saw the faces. Russell Bufalino out of Pennsylvania, quiet, unreadable. Carlos Marcello, the Louisiana boss, with his Cuban cigar always in hand. From Chicago came Sam Giancana, bringing Johnny Roselli with him. Santo Trafficante showed from Florida, still nursing his losses in Havana. They met at Joe Sanka's Gold Coast Lounge, a place where the lines between mobsters, Cuban exiles, CIA men, and politicians blurred into one long conversation. The question on the table was Cuba, the Kennedys. Where did they stand? What was their play? If Kennedy gave the green light, the mob would swing behind him. If not, they'd look elsewhere. Gambino, the most careful man in the room, noticed the smallest thing. Russell Bufalino wasn't smoking. Not a puff. Carlo leaned in and asked why. Jimmy Blue Eyes Allo nudged him. It was a bet. Bufalino had given up smoking, and Jimmy had money on whether he'd last. Russell took it so seriously he hadn't lit up in months. But that wasn't the story. The story was Cuba. When Castro came in, Santo Trafficante, Lansky, and the rest had barely escaped with their lives. Russell had been there too. He was supposed to bring back one last haul of cash, but had to flee before he could grab it. Castro's goons were already moving through the hotels. The money was gone. The CIA knew about it, and they never forgot. Years later, Time magazine would put it in print. Bufalino, James Plumeri, and Salvatore Sally Burns Granello had left $450,000 behind in Havana. It belonged to New York, Chicago, and Pittsburgh. When the CIA planned the Bay of Pigs, they called in the mob. Giancana and Roselli were asked to kill Castro. Bufalino, Plumeri, and Granello were asked to spy. They set up a network, spent part of the lost cash to pay informants. The intelligence was garbage. They claimed uprisings were brewing, but nothing ever came. And everyone knew there was only one road Castro's tanks could take to the beach. The three men hoped Castro would fall so they could reclaim their money. What they didn't say was that Plumeri and Granello had skimmed another $300,000, burying it in a field outside Havana. Both would later end up murdered in New York, still dreaming of digging up that stash. Back in Miami, the bosses made their choices. Most swung to Kennedy. Marcello went the other way. He bet on Nixon and Lyndon Johnson, backing them with Louisiana's political machine. The Long family, Russell Long, the whole dynasty. Jim Garrison would soon rise to district attorney, surrounded by Marcello's men. Bobby Baker handled the bribery pipeline straight into Washington. Down south, everything, bribes, blackmail, gun running, was kicked up a notch. Marcello's camp put real muscle behind Cuba. He bailed out Trafficante, worked with ex-FBI men, CIA operatives, David Ferry, Guy Bannister, and men like Ruby. Cuban exiles were trained in Louisiana, then shipped to Guatemala or the Dominican Republic for the finishing touch. Guns flowed like water. Stolen military shipments. Arms deals through Russell Bufalino's industrial connections. These weren't small street rackets. This was the Mafia working hand in glove with America's shadow government. For Gambino, this was the big league. Since the early 1900s, the Southern mob had worked with the United Fruit Company to topple governments. Now Carlo was watching it firsthand. Control over radio, newspapers, television, even Hollywood. Real power. He put money into the operations. He understood the scale. This wasn't the docks. This was Normandy, and the battlefield was Cuba. Back in New York, Gambino fortified his own empire. Blackmail out of Manhattan, Brooklyn, Harlem. Politicians compromised, judges on strings, lawyers in his pocket. With CIA help, with FBI blind eyes, with IRS cases disappearing, Gambino stayed untouchable. Like Luciano, like Costello, but colder. He never hesitated to have someone clipped. His bench was deep. Paul Castellano, his cousin, running his own wing of the family. Nino and Roy De Meo, whose crew would one day earn the title of serial killers. Agnello della Croce, stone killer. Future bosses like John Gotti came up under this shadow. The Gambino family wasn't just powerful. It was violent in ways the old bosses hadn't dared. New York was rotting. Heroin, gambling, prostitution. It spilled out of the slums and into the open. Everyone knew who ran it. The Irish had been pushed aside. The Jews were gone. The Italians, Sicilians, sat at the top. The corruption infected everything. Unions, the Teamsters, casinos, marriages between families that tied New York to Detroit, Detroit to Chicago, Chicago back to New Orleans. One snitch could unravel the whole web. But Gambino kept walking untouched. No prison time, no deportation, nothing. He saw Costello in prison, Luciano deported, Adonis exiled. He stayed. And now Harlem was shifting too. Soon a man would be coming home from prison, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, a black gangster with respect in both Harlem and Little Italy. He was doing time for a narcotics charge, but never ratted out his Italian friends. He was smart, polite, played chess, and carried weight on the street. When Bumpy came back, he was tied to a rising figure, Malcolm X. The civil rights movement was boiling. Harlem was alive. And in 1960, Fidel Castro himself came to Harlem. He stayed at the Hotel Teresa. Malcolm X was there. And Carlo Gambino, watching it all unfold, knew the game was changing. In 1950, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson beat a numbers charge after cops caught him with slips while trying to pull a friend out of trouble. Word spread uptown that he might crack and spill on the whole gambling setup, but Bumpy didn't talk. Instead, whispers spread that Harlem's bankers were getting restless, furious at the kickbacks demanded by cops. Brooklyn's grand jury was already tearing into graft and gambling, and people wondered if Harlem was next. The following year, Harlem's calm broke wide open. Federal agents moved on a massive narcotics operation. 12 men arrested, 60 workers on the street, 300 junkies served daily, even school kids. At the top, prosecutors named Bumpy Johnson. He wasn't just Harlem's gambler anymore. The feds painted him as an overlord, running $1 million dope network. Nothing moved, they said, without his approval. Bumpy denied it all. He was a businessman, he said, with dry cleaning shops and apartment houses. But the indictment told a different story. A wholesale operation feeding smaller dealers, his supply lines reaching outside New York, maybe overseas. Bail was set at $25,000. He paid it and walked. Harlem saw him hauled off in handcuffs, then saw him back on 7th Avenue the next day. Sharp suit, cool smile, the street still his. The pressure didn't let up. That summer, a grand jury hit him with fresh indictments, linking him to 27 others. The feds called him one of the vice overlords of Harlem. Alongside him were Italian names, Di Martini, Traina. Men the government said had 5 years' worth of heroin stashed away. It wasn't just Harlem anymore. The game was bigger. Then, in 1952, somebody put 3 bullets in Bumpy Johnson's chest. He survived. Cops chased a suspect known as the Hawk, but the motive was a mystery. Harlem talked. Some said it was payback, others a warning. Either way, the message was clear. Even Bumpy could bleed. By 1953, Harlem's gamblers were back in the spotlight. The Joe Walcott-Rocky Marciano fight had the neighborhood on fire. Wagers stacked up, 60 grand, maybe 100. Bumpy was in, laying money down like everybody else. He wouldn't say how much. Harlem guessed plenty. By 1953, the walls finally closed in. Federal prosecutors put Bumpy Johnson on trial, charging him with selling and conspiring to sell heroin. His partner and lifelong friend Nat Pettigrew went down with him. The case was brutal, An all-white jury, 11 men and 1 woman, deliberated 2 hours and came back guilty on every count. The government story hinged on 2 black witnesses, Agent William Newkirk, posing as a hustler from Buffalo, and James Cy Hunter, a Harlem snitch. But the real blow came from inside Bumpy's own circle, Freddie Flash Walker. Flash was a kid Bumpy had once saved from sleeping on pool tables. He gave him work, first as a houseboy, then running numbers. But on the stand, Flash swore Bumpy had pushed him deeper, sending him downtown to pick up packages of heroin, $10 a trip. Then Flash admitted he tried to muscle in on Bumpy's connections, moving heroin on his own. He got caught, cut a deal, and came into court telling the government story. Bumpy hit back. He said Flash was lying, that the kid had tried running a scam with phony checks, and even dragged a white girl from a wealthy family into it. When Bumpy found out, he laid Flash out cold on 7th Avenue. After that, Bumpy claimed, Flash wanted payback and helped the feds set him up. A former postal clerk, Lovey Hamilton, took the stand and backed Bumpy. She said Flash tried to rope her into planting dope in Bumpy's apartment, threatening to kill her when she refused. He gave her a diamond stick pin to pawn, stalked her when she ran, and finally shook her down for a camera just to scrape up cash. Her testimony painted Flash as a hustler, willing to burn anyone to save himself. It didn't matter. Harlem gamblers, numbers men, Bumpy's wife and daughter all packed the courtroom, but they watched him fall. When the verdict came, his wife screamed. Bumpy didn't flinch. "Don't cry, baby," he told her. "It's the breaks in the game. Somebody loses, somebody wins." On June 12, 1953, Judge Edward Dymock gave him 15 years and a $9,000 fine. The government called him the crime boss of Harlem, the king of numbers and narcotics both. Bumpy Johnson, Harlem's granite man, was going away again. When Bumpy Johnson went down in '53, Harlem started asking the only question that mattered: who's next? On 125th Street, the know-it-alls swore the underworld was dead, cleaned out since Kefauver's commission tore through the city. But it was a lie. The hustlers and gamblers all knew the truth. Bumpy's prison stretch left a vacuum, and the hopefuls were already circling. They talked tough in bars and pool halls, but none of them had the steel. The East Side mob still held the purse strings, and when their collectors came uptown in sharp suits, Harlem's loudest voices went quiet. Everyone knew Harlem might have the faces, but the Italians held the muscle. Inside Danbury Prison, the story was different. Bumpy had enemies waiting for him at the chess table: Red Dillard Morrison, Fess Taylor, and Skeets Hoffler. Old Harlem names locked up and bitter. They said they were saving him a seat, waiting to settle scores. Their hate went back years, to a night when Red Dillard slashed Chink Cunningham nearly to death, and Bumpy, playing Avenger, stormed past cops and gangsters at Sydenham Hospital, just to slap Dillard in the mouth as he lay bleeding. Later, gunfire crackled on 14th Street when Bumpy and Red crossed paths again. They both lived, but the feud never died. Now, behind the walls, they wanted their revenge, and they mocked the confidence with which Bumpy shrugged off his 15-year sentence. Bumpy still thought he'd beat the case. He filed his appeal, smiling in court, telling his wife it was just another hand in the game. Harlem gamblers whispered maybe he'd walk. But in December, the U.S. Court of Appeals slammed the door. Judges Frank, Swan, and Medina upheld the conviction. 3 counts, 5 years each, stacked back to back. 15 years, $9,000 in fines. Nat Pettigrew, his old running mate, was already deep into his own 22-year stretch. Harlem said Nat was beginning to regret keeping his mouth shut. The handouts promised for his silence had dried up. Bumpy Johnson, the man Harlem once looked to as its rock, was now free on bail for the moment. But the court had spoken. The East Side mob was still eating. The Harlem boys were too scared to claim the crown, and in Danbury, 3 old enemies waited, plotting the day Bumpy finally walked through those gates. The new year in Harlem began in silence. No brass bands, no crowded bars, no rowdy noise on 7th Avenue. Just tension. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson had surrendered to federal marshals the week before Christmas, starting a 15-year bid for narcotics. He'd vowed years earlier he'd never see the inside of a cell again. Now he was on his way to Leavenworth. His last-minute appeal for Supreme Court review was denied, the mandate clear. Guilty on 3 counts, 5 years each, consecutive, plus $9 grand in fines. On the street, the surrender cut deeper than the sentence. Bumpy had been more than Harlem's gambler, more than its dope king. He was the mediator, the man who kept uptown's bankers and the East Side mob from cutting each other's throats. With him gone, the balance was gone. For years, Harlem's numbers men had swallowed smaller cuts, letting the Italians walk in wearing Brooks Brothers suits, collect envelopes stuffed with housewives' nickels and porters' dimes, and stroll back downtown untouched. Bumpy was the one who made it work, the referee between Harlem pride and East Side muscle. Now the East Siders wanted it all. In back rooms along 7th Avenue, the old policy barons held quiet meetings, searching for a successor. None emerged. Everyone knew the job came with more than tribute. It came with a target on your back. Harlem's hustlers grumbled, some vowing to fight, swearing not to let white interlopers strip the neighborhood the way they had the bars and taverns years before. But talk was cheap. Without Bumpy, there was no one left with the weight to enforce it. Inside prison, the fight shifted to the courts. His lawyers filed writs, but the Supreme Court wouldn't even hear the case. 15 years stood. Then came the transfer. By spring of '54, Bumpy Johnson was no longer in Kansas. The feds shipped him west, to Alcatraz, the Rock, home of the hardest convicts in America. The FBI had never broken him, but they were still taking shots. Agents went after his wife, Mamie, trying to seize her Cadillac, claiming it was Bumpy's. She refused, telling them they'd have to take the keys from her by force. Harlem's toughest man was locked on an island in San Francisco Bay. His empire was collapsing, his rivals circling, his enemies waiting. But Bumpy Johnson's name still hung over 125th Street, heavy as a shadow no one dared step into. By the winter of 1954, Harlem was marking time in a new calendar, AB, after Bumpy. 1 year since Johnson surrendered at Foley Square, Harlem's underworld looked unrecognizable. The empire willed to him by Big Joe Richards had splintered, its pieces snapped up almost overnight by white bankrollers from downtown. The Italians and their midtown allies now ran the numbers spots, the horse rooms, even the dope corners. Harlem's operators, once kings in their own right, were reduced to errand boys, or casualties. 2 of the men who inherited Bumpy's gambling roots, Bohack and Black John, were swiftly busted. Nobody believed it was luck. The whispers said they'd been fingered by the same white interests they thought they could outplay. The rest of Harlem's independents fared no better. Black policy men faced constant raids, while white drops ran untouched. Small operators disappeared, squeezed out by cops, politics, or bullets. The few left were clinging to the edges, watching leather satchels full of nickels and dimes, once Harlem's lifeblood, walk straight downtown. Even Bumpy's enemies admitted it. If he did nothing else, he kept the white boys out. They feared him, feared the weight he carried. Without him, Harlem was wide open. The shift didn't stop at 125th Street. The Bronx, once Little Harlem, was in the middle of its own silent war. Negro bankers trying to hold numbers routes, while white rivals pressed with political backing. Brooklyn told the same story, white combines coining fortunes, while black operators were hounded by cops, even those paying off. In Queens, the racket stayed small, candy stores and barbershops running penny ante numbers, while one lone hustler controlled the borough's heroin. Westchester saw the last of its black racket barons die or retire, leaving the field to white operators without a fight. Harlem's only answer was talk of war. A few stubborn bankers vowed not to be pushed out, swearing they'd fight for what was left. Reports surfaced of torpedoes imported from California, spotted in bars along 7th Avenue. To some, it looked like Bumpy was still pulling strings from Alcatraz, laying groundwork for retaliation. Inside the prisons, the landscape had shifted too. His old partner Nat Pettigrew was sick in Danbury. Red Dillard Morrison, Skeets Hoffler, and Fess Taylor, once rivals, now inmates, were broken men. Dillard rumoured to be paralysed after a fall. On the streets, faces from the old days resurfaced. Freddie Parsons back in circulation, Flash Walker, Bumpy's one-time protégé turned government witness, thriving. 1 year after Bumpy's fall, Harlem was leaderless. The East Siders had carved up the pie. The black underworld was scattered, some hiding, some bowing, some plotting revenge. And everyone knew the legacy Bumpy left wasn't peace. It was a promise, violence and bloodshed still to come. By 1956, Harlem was still living after Bumpy. The man himself sat in Leavenworth, but his name still hovered over Lenox Avenue like a storm cloud. His lieutenants were breaking down, Red Dillard Morrison facing conspiracy charges, Fess Taylor hauled in from the federal pen to testify against him. Harlem's underworld was eating itself, and into that vacuum slid a new breed. They weren't the old Harlem goons, loud, sloppy, guns flashing under cheap jackets. These were smooth operators, quiet, sharp-dressed, average age 30, with time already served and lessons learned. They called themselves protection men, but the neighborhood whispered another name, the Black Hand. It started simple. A Lenox Avenue policy baron signed a contract, $50 a week for each numbers drop. After that, every small-timer fell into line. Resistance was met with beatings, sometimes bullets. The protection boys soon had clients across Harlem, numbers bankers, drug peddlers, after-hours joints, even red-light houses. Money flowed. Blood followed close behind. Insiders swore Bumpy's hand was in it. From his cell, they said he was orchestrating the scheme, keeping the East Side guessing and reminding Harlem who really made the rules. Maybe it was myth, maybe it was truth. Either way, his name was still the currency. Then came 1957. Bumpy had always known the Italians. They called it the Black Hand, the Union Siciliana, the Mafia. It didn't matter. It was organized crime, run by Italian bosses with Jewish counterparts, using every ethnic group as muscle. Blacks, Puerto Ricans, Irish, whoever could carry a gun or swing a bat. Then the blood spilled in New York. Costello shot. Albert Anastasia gunned down in a barbershop. Anastasia, the butcher who'd terrorized Harlem's black dock workers, was finally gone. From his cell, Bumpy watched the syndicate crack. The old guard, Luciano Costello, were finished. Genovese was taking his shot, and Gambino was waiting to move in. But Appalachin was different. In November, the Mafia's secret came into the open. A farm upstate, dozens of names he'd heard for years. Luciano's men, Genovese, Bonanno, Gambino, all caught in one place. By the time Bumpy got out, the commission itself would be shaken, men locked up, power shifting. The Mafia had lost Havana. They'd lost cover. They weren't about to lose Harlem. Not to the cops, not to the feds, and not to Bumpy Johnson. He wasn't free yet. But soon he would be. And when he walked back onto 7th Avenue, the war for Harlem would be waiting. By 1960, 3 years after Sergeant Edgar Croswell's roadblock in upstate New York had turned the Mafia into front-page news, the government's big victory was falling apart. The Appalachin convictions, 20 men nailed in federal court on conspiracy charges, had just been overturned. The appeals court didn't just reverse the case. They humiliated the Justice Department. Judge J. Edward Lombard, writing with Judges Charles Clark and Henry Friendly, said flat out, "There wasn't a shred of legal evidence that the Barbara barbecue was criminal, illegal, or even improper. The government had built its case on assumptions. The court ruled. It didn't know what happened on November 14, 1957. It only knew 60-odd mobsters, bosses, captains, soldiers were caught running through the mud in their Florsheims when the troopers moved in. That wasn't enough to put men in prison. In America," the judges wrote, "we still respect the dignity of the individual, and even an unsavory character is not to be imprisoned except on definite proof of a specific crime." When the convictions first came down in January 1959, Attorney General William Rogers had called it a crushing blow against organized crime. Each defendant got 3 to 5 years plus $10,000 fines. Russell Bufalino, the quiet boss from Pennsylvania, Santo Trafficante, back from Havana, Joe Profaci, the olive oil king of Brooklyn, Frank DeSimone from Los Angeles, Natale Evola, Carmine Lombardozzi, Paul Castellano, Carlo Gambino, all were swept up. Even Vito Genovese, already the most feared man in America, was in the car stopped at Croswell's roadblock. Their excuses were laughable, but the courts didn't care. One said he was visiting Barbara, who was ill. Another claimed he dropped by to deliver shirts. Profaci said he was stopping in to see an old friend. A shoe worker said he was just helping with the coffee. One guest claimed he got lost on the way to Wilkes Bar. Another said he only wanted advice about draft beer equipment. Gambino supposedly wanted to talk to Barbara about heart surgery. The government thought the lies proved conspiracy. The appeals court said it only proved men lying to protect themselves. Of the 27 originally indicted, 4 had been fugitives, 2 severed for illness, 1 acquitted at trial. 20 remained, all convicted. Now all 20 walked free on bail, their records cleared, their money intact. Bufalino, Ostico, Ciandra, men from Pennsylvania coal country, were suddenly off the hook. Only Bufalino still faced deportation proceedings. The Solicitor General, J. Lee Rankin, had 30 days to decide whether to appeal to the Supreme Court. If he asked for a delay, the decision might fall into the lap of the new administration, John F. Kennedy's. That possibility had the underworld watching closely. For Gambino and Lucchese, the timing was brutal. It was October 1960, 3 years after Albert Anastasia's barbershop execution and the Appalachin raid that followed. Newspapers were still running headlines about the Gangsters Convention. Reporters kept pressing Washington, "What are you going to do about organized crime? About the unions? About the mafia?" And now the courts were saying, nothing happened. The great case, the one that was supposed to put the mob on trial, had collapsed into a bootstrap operation, as the judges called it, the government pulling itself up by assumptions, harassing men it couldn't prove had done a thing. For the mafia, the reversal was vindication. For America, it was another sign that the system wasn't built to touch them. By the time the election fireworks went off in December 1960, Gambino was already thinking 2 steps ahead. Kennedy had won, the country was celebrating, but Carlo sat with Meyer Lansky, the old Jewish financier who'd become as close to him as family. Through Anastasia, through Lucchese, through Bufalino and Trafficante, they'd built ties. Lansky was crucial now, not just for money, but for teaching Gambino the art of laundering his name through charities and industries. The future was clear. Logistics, trucking, shipping. America was booming, goods moving in and out of ports, trucks crossing the highways. Gambino wanted the arteries of the economy. Red Levine, the Jewish hitman who once killed Salvatore Maranzano, was still around, still trusted. To Gambino, shaking hands with Maranzano's killer was like touching history. Levine carried messages between Italy and America, close to Luciano, the man in Naples who was now growing suspicious and paranoid. Money was tight overseas, and Luciano was watching Lansky with narrowed eyes. In those nights with Lansky, Gambino opened up. They'd sit for hours, talking about family, about history, about what they'd survived. That winter of 1960, as Kennedy's victory hung over the city, Gambino told Lansky something that had stuck with him since the 1930s. Back then, he'd heard Luciano brag about helping Franklin Roosevelt. Anastasia's crew, Luciano's men, had worked delegates to back FDR. Gambino, young and low on influence, stayed silent. He remembered Roosevelt's words, though. He recalled the story of the American police officer sent to Sicily to investigate the Mafia. When the man was murdered, Franklin Roosevelt mourned the loss, but aimed his anger squarely at the Sicilians and the Italian government. He blamed them for protecting criminals, for allowing corruption to thrive, and his words were cutting. To Gambino, it was another reminder that men like Roosevelt didn't see a difference between a gangster and a Sicilian immigrant. They lumped them all together. And this wasn't the first time. Gambino never forgot what he'd heard about 1891 in New Orleans, when 11 Sicilians were lynched after a police chief was killed. Roosevelt, then just a young politician, said the lynching was a good thing. Those words stuck like a scar. To Gambino, it meant that no matter how much money you had, no matter how much power, America's ruling class would always see Sicilians as expendable. Truman had been different. Backed by the Pendergast machine in Kansas City, mob connected, he played ball. Eisenhower and Nixon after him? That was a mob administration. Nixon helped build the CIA, which gave gangsters protection and clearance overseas. To Gambino, that felt like a safe bet. He'd made mistakes. Who hadn't? But he'd backed both Cuba operations, the early push which failed in August of 1959, and the Bay of Pigs, which would occur under Kennedy. The Kennedys, though, they were different. Maybe we made a mistake, Gambino said to Lansky. He wanted reassurance. Lansky gave him a story instead. Years back in Boston, Costello, Luciano, Bugsy Siegel and Lansky had hijacked a liquor shipment. Standard practice was, if you're robbed, you surrender the load. But these Irishmen fought. A shootout left several dead. Only later did they find out that shipment belonged to Joseph Kennedy. From then on, it was bad blood. When Costello tried to build a legitimate liquor empire overseas, Kennedy, by then US ambassador to Britain, cut him off, grabbed the contracts for himself, froze Costello out. Costello hated Joseph Kennedy for that, and Costello passed that hatred onto Carlos Marcello, his southern protege. But he never blamed the sons. He wasn't the type to pass a father's sins onto his children. Still, the resentment lingered. Now, Costello was retired, Vito locked away, Luciano stuck in Italy. The streets belonged to Gambino and Agnello della Croce, with Joseph Riccobono as consigliere. Lucchese had his own house in order, Vincent Rao advising him, Stefano La Salle as underboss. When Lucchese would die years later, Carmine Tramunti would step up. Profaci, the olive oil don, was still boss of his family, with Joseph Magliocco as his number 2. But Profaci was old, 61, and sick. In 1961, Gambino and Lucchese paid him a visit, asking him to step down. The meeting turned tense. Profaci, weak as he was, summoned enough strength to lash out. He accused Gambino of plotting, of whispering in the ears of the Gallo brothers, of sowing division. Carlo didn't raise his voice. He denied it all, kept it polite, patient. But when he and Lucchese left, they knew trouble was coming. Profaci's family was tied by blood and marriage to others. it had to be handled carefully. What Gambino didn't see was betrayal. Magliocco, the heir apparent, had quietly aligned with Joe Bonanno. Together, they were plotting to kill Gambino and Lucchese. Bonanno was still head of his own family, but he'd taken a hit. Carmine Galante, his bulldog, was on the run and facing prison on narcotics charges. Galante was volatile, impossible to leash. When he got out, he knew exactly why he'd gone down. Costello. And he made Costello pay. He blew up the old man's mausoleum, declaring war. From there, the killings stacked up, Galante himself, Tommy Eboli, others. The 60s bled into the 70s, and nothing slowed. Bosses fell. Governments cracked down harder. The mafia's grip loosened. A new power rose in Washington, the corporate mafia, the political mafia. The old world of Sicilians running the street rackets would survive, but their ultimate purpose was shifting. Sooner or later, Gambino knew the mafia wouldn't be running America. They'd be serving it, as the strong arm for the real bosses in Washington and Wall Street.